exciting, but we've got something good coming up now. So as I've already said, we're delighted to welcome Patrick. He studied architecture at the University of Stuttgart and at South Bank University. He received his PhD from the Institute of Cultural Sciences at the University of Klagenfurt. I hope I pronounced that.
Pretty good.
Pretty good, not very good. My German's not very good. Oh, yeah. So Patrick joined Zaha Hadid in 1988, and he's had a very successful career as director and senior designer at the firm. And he's worked with Zaha on on the majority of their obviously really successful projects. So I don't need to say any more. So I'll pass over to Patrick. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. I was here about 8 years ago at the beginning of the school. I'm happy to come back, this time invited by the students. At the time it was Gordana who brought me over. A lot of things happened in the last 8 years in terms of what I want to talk about. The topic of the title I've announced was Parametricism 2.0. When I first came here I hadn't even starting to talk about parametricism. The idea here is that what we've been working on, myself and a lot of people of my generation and a series of younger generations, nearly now for 20 years, or at least for 15 years I would say, gearing up with computational power and developing complex geometries and starting to apply these to complex inner city sites, layered multi-use, mixed-use complex urban conditions, urban fields, but also interiors, and the sense of heightened interconnectivity, sets of spaces, and controlling them with these ever more sophisticated tools. That agenda, which let's say 10, 15 years in, I started to think about requiring a name to gather its actors under some kind of an umbrella and flag to move forward and push that into the mainstream. That was the agenda. That was motivating some of my writings of that era. Some of that has not come to pass. We had a big financial crisis in 2008 and a lot of stagnation and further crises like 2010 debt crisis in Europe. We had Arab Spring and upheaval there. We had the Occupy movement and many, I would say, distractions which took a little bit the steam out of this movement and also led, on the one hand, in the real life, a lot of steam was taken out, and in terms of the schools of architecture, there's been kind of breaking away from this agenda and the reorientation, maybe to do with social issues and political issues and a kind of lack of nerve and trying to push these kind of projects and agendas forward. So that's why I've been starting to talk about the crisis of parametricism and an attempt to also reflect what are the external reasons, as I meant, but what was also the internal shortcomings of this paradigm. And maybe we have been concentrating too long on technical issues. Of course, you have to gear up with the computational skills. We have been developing formal repertoires, but we haven't managed to, as a movement, to articulate fully what are the societal advantages, the agendas, the progressive agenda of this work, its social meaning, societal meaning. And that's what I want to start talking about. I mean, I've been talking about it for a while, but I want to encourage colleagues and collaborators to start focusing on, because that's also what a lot of the different schools and students started to get into, debating social political issues, because we are living in kind of inflamed socio-economic and political times. And what would be the contribution of what I call parametricism to these discourses? And that's what I want to hint at a little bit. So my understanding of architecture has always been, and recently more articulately been, the understanding that the core competency of architecture and all design is spatial communication. So where am I coming from? The idea here is that we need to understand what is really our critical contribution to the built environment as architects in distinction to all the engineering disciplines, right? Engineering disciplines who deliver all the technical functionality, agendas which, efficiencies of production, efficiency of structural articulation, but also, of course, the whole idea of environmental logics. But if you think about it, when you're working on a big design team, all the technical elements, including facade design and details, envelope design details, is all engineering disciplines. So what is left for us, in a sense, is, well, to think through with the client how the brief might be interpreted, what are the social logic that need to be embedded into space. So these issues become foregrounded, organizational issues, layout and planning issues, but there kind of the agenda comes from the client. And ultimately it's a translation of these agendas into what I call spatial communications. So how these things are articulated, made transparent, made navigable, orientable, that's the core competency, which has a lot to do with how things start to look like, how they appear, what distinctions you make, what nuance and character you give spaces. That is our expertise, and that's the idea of the built environment as a great broadcast, as a text that sorts us, that orients us and distributes us into all the different situations we need to move through in our productive days, weeks, and months, if you like. And I'm talking about the design of information-rich environments as the core competency, because I think the agenda what we're trying to address is the contemporary metropolis. I mean, you live here in a kind of countryside, idyllic situation, but it's very close to London, and London is that great megalopolis which sucks in more people every year than any other place in Europe. And this is the productive hothouses of the world are these kind of large cities and concentrations, conurbations, where many people come together of different backgrounds, skills, and these kind of density, complex dense agglomerations, I think is where our task lies. Because another point I'm making is that contemporary society is basically a information society, communication society, where new productivity gains, where the development of our prosperity depends on communicating better and more intelligently, being more connected. Each of us is more productive by knowing more people, understanding what's going on, participating in many more things, being part of networks, and each day expanding that network and calibrating what we are doing with respect to what everyone else is doing. And that's what we need to stay together, be in touch, know what's going on, and participate, right? We do that through the media, on internet, through the mobile phone, but this sets us free. We do that also face-to-face and roaming and browsing the city and getting a sense of what's going on, and we're working in business connections with lots of consultants and people coming into big, dense agglomerations. That's, I think, where communication is a critical resource. I think all problems of society are problems of communication. All further productivity gains in a society based on innovation, design, and research development are communication issues. So when I'm talking about an information-rich environment, it means you step into a space and you're confronted with many choices, and you can quickly identify and see who to approach, what to participate in, what to seek out further, and to have a kind of orienting matrix you navigate. And the built environment needs to be designed like this kind of text or systems of signification. And that comes up with this concept of a new architectural semiology. The built environment designed as a system of science, which allows us to find each other in different communication scenarios, which are quite selective. You know, we need to also scan crowds and understand in a city which would be likely and probable people and events which speak to us. Out of this whole kind of matrix, we're all seeking out and finding relevant communication partners, and that means all the signals, including, by the way, fashion systems you pick out through phenomenological presences of how people look like. You need to pick out where you follow, who you might match with, etc. And the same is how the city looks like, which spaces and scenarios and bars And environments am I seeking out because that's where I find vital connections to make myself more vibrant and vital. So I've written about this in books and published some articles about this idea that these new computational resources allow us to create these dense, articulate urban spaces. And yeah, so the hope was, after in 2008, when I started to write some of these manifestos, we had already worked up, techniques of working with algorithms, working with gradients, working with associative logics, things which I can see now in the book here is not so prevalent, but which was incredibly hot and prevalent, for instance, all the way through the 90s at Columbia University and many other. It started at the A also in the early 90s, going through the mid 2000s, let's say. Everybody was working on this, and then I think in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, there was a kind of fallback or backlash or move away from this. The hope was still, and I would argue that this kind of work is still the only serious candidate for having a total makeover of the built environment the way modernism achieved in the 20th century. I still believe that for the 21st century epochal style, the kind of work I'm talking about is the only truly innovative work which has really some radical new categories, some new agendas, some new techniques, some new facilities, and new values is pushing and pursuing. Whereas a lot of what's going on now, this kind of backlash, leads a lot of times to, I would say, some kind of a retro design languages, which are circulating in Pandat. It's kind of going back to modernism, maybe even the kind of recycling of postmodernism recently. So I think it's very important to first of all, this is a claim I'm staking, is that Parametricism, although it has its forward surge has been kind of blunted by the conditions I'm talking about, is still the only viable candidate to really make an impact and change the built environment in ways which the way modernism had changed it. But modernism went into crisis in the 70s, 80s. And since then, there's been a series of attempts to understand what this means and how the built environment could be pushed forward in line with the new types of societies which have been evolving. And I think there's still only this one answer, but there's at the moment a kind of lack of engagement and nerve with respect to this answer, to do with the general stagnation that I was talking about. So it's important that to realize that the great epochal styles, which in a sense structure architectural history, mean something. They're not just changing fashions. They are adaptations of the built environment to fundamental technological and societal conditions. They're really civilizatory epochs which are tied up and matched up with the various architectural styles. And that if there is at the moment a series of competing styles, really the question is which of them is becoming and is able to become the physiognomy and style of the 21st century. So in terms of parametricism, I would say there is a definition I could give of it, that all elements of architecture have become parametrically malleable. There's this kind of incredible malleability and versatility and adaptiveness, which has that striking advantage that you can things, rather than placing them next to each other, like the elements of classical architecture, where the cylinder is next to the cube, is next to the pyramid, or the pyramid on top of the cube, etc. These things aggregate in uninflected, isolated elements composing, that we can kind of let things inflect each other, resonate with each other, and become and show that they communicate with each other rather than sitting next to each other. And that has to do with this idea of everything communicates with everything else, the way we and all our events have to be communicated, be in touch with what's going on everywhere else. So that network society means also a networking of the different spaces, and that means you need to articulate, to show how one space radiates through another, one space leads to another, connects to another, intersects with another, rather than being just kind of hermetically sealed and separate. And that is the new era, new style. And the tools the way we work, we don't use a ruler where we draw a kind of straight line or take a compass and make a circle next to that. We're setting up these kind of dynamical systems of lines which coalesce and self-organize into patterns, into coherent patterns, which have an intricacy and elegance and beauty, but an order. I call this complex variegated order. It's like the order of nature. And that's much more elegant, a powerful way of working than kind of looking at an empty page and kind of drawing a line and then thinking what should be the next line, and they make a few lines which stay kind of stiff and inert, and no, you let systems develop geometries and then you tweak the parameters and you let this evolve, and that's a much more powerful and efficient way of working, and each of what these things produce then can become kind of architectures which weave into the urban texture and have coherency from inside to outside, and they generate a kind of new sensibility of space, which is not space A, space B, space C, but a kind of continuously shifting, moving, drifting scene where the screen regenerates and you have bifurcations, ramifications, but there's an order, there's a logic. It's not a kind of random garbage spill chaos. Instead of using, flat plates, just pile them up, or walls, the surfaces become active. They're inflected. You can be informed of what's going on. Somebody steps onto a surface, it generates a kind of ripple effect. When you place something on the surface, every action is a reaction. It's kind of alive and can maybe something is going on at the corner there which can radiate through. So it all throughout the space, that where you're moving closer to this event, etc. And we can generate spaces which have that continuous fluidity and flow where one shelving condition morphs into a bench, maybe into a bench with backing, and you generate kind of spaces where there's not something determined at A, then you move on to something B, but there's a continuous shifting and movement of event potentials across a kind of field. Just quickly go through some of these. And this works for line, surface, or plane, and volume. You have dynamical systems generate compositions where these things have to kind of fuse, connect, tear apart, and maybe envelope something. And we're working these at AADRL where I'm teaching. We generate the organisms. We also work with material systems. There's kind of this inherent self-organizing potential where matter and various internal and external forces generate structure, and then it's not the point exactly what is where, but the kind of certain characters, certain gradients, and this is what we then kind of set up. We can set up also responsive environments where something moves across. It can be tracked, it can be represented, it's present, it's amplified, announced. This is all communication. Something is interactive, and you can use us to in the end freeze a state of equilibrium, or you have actually some of these systems keep staying and play kinetically. An important thing here, there's multiple subsystems. There's the dots, there's the little enveloping line, and then there's the structure, and they interact. Every action is a reaction. So you're setting up these systems of interaction, rather than having things just placed next to each other and everything is dead. You add something, nothing changes. You add something, a lot of things changes. Everything has to be readjusted, and that means the presence of the new element is announced, is made felt, communicates it's present, and everybody communicates with everybody else through these systems. And if you apply that to urbanism, we can, instead of having two existing villages, an empty site, instead of putting a third element in the middle, we generate a texture which weaves across, which connects to the existing, affiliates and makes connections and communications. Then it differentiates and sets up quite different scenarios, large towers, clearings, small towers, medium-sized towers, and then feeds back into the other existing cities. So you suddenly can create also larger syntheses. And again, it's all about making the different characters and textures fuse into each other, communicate with each other, and you can find and follow from each other. So this is different student works, and I've out and go a bit of a micro view of what the kind of advantages one gains, for instance, when one works with these curves. I showed you that they can be complex and intricate, and they're responding to each other on a much simpler level. In building up an information-rich environment, why are curves, for instance, better than straight lines? You know, you might say, well, first of all, they're a bit more expensive. Yes, you're getting there, but they deliver something. They're not just pretty, right? So, and that's a little demonstration I want to give. So react? No. What's that capacity? So, you're studying the idea, for instance, of overlap. Something, by the way, which was is an important move you can make now in architecture, which you couldn't make 30 years ago, by the way. So, when you want to build up complexity, it's not just putting next to each other, letting things overlap and interpenetrate. When you have two initial spaces, and they already set up a third space. So what I'm now talking about is so that we have these two rectangles, and the space A is the intersection of these two, and that's important. Oftentimes, when you have, for instance, in a company, you have team A and team B, but then they're working together on a project, so there's an overlap. Some members of team A can collaborate with some members of team B, and they're creating a kind of sub-intersection domain, so domains of competency overlap, and that's very common. How do you place this diagram? You have a space for team A, you have a place for team B, but then there is this kind of overlap condition. How do you articulate that? Maybe you can have spaces which overlap. Something like this, where you have a new area where those who belong to both teams, as it were, or both spaces, belong to both territories, will be in that segment A. And you put another on, this is one smaller, so you can see here, we can see in the overview, the bird's eye view, that area A is not something I've drawn, it's just the resultant of the intersection of several. But when I'm inside A, I don't know that. I have no registration. I'm totally unaware that I'm in an intersection space. So basically, inside A, it is as if I'm just in A. I don't know how this is generated, right? So I'm oblivious to the way this place is connected and generated, and its meaning, the meaning of an overlap of three other territories. If I would work with curves, I can do the same thing. You can see here already something different happens. There is a clear registration that I am in an overlap condition, that the shape I'm in tells me that I'm in the intersection of two spaces. Use of curve allows for that. And I can also see the character of these two spaces. I see the kind of one circular of a certain size. I can read the size and direction of that space of that wall segment. And the same would be here. This segment also tells me that I'm part of that larger oval. So suddenly, that's what I call information rich. That space has more information because it tells me about the genesis and connectivity and belonging diagram of this space where I am. So what is in front of me in my field of vision allows me inference for what is beyond my field of vision. That's what I call information rich. And if you put a third one in, yes, even that registers. Once you know the logic, you can infer back this as intersection. So the complexity of that space you're encountering, you can infer back, and it gives you information if you rigorously build up your geometry, right? And that is what if you work with squares and straight lines, you don't know. A square wall doesn't know, for instance, it's neither convex nor concave, so you don't know if you're outside of something, inside something, how big that is, etc. What direction it has, you know nothing basically about the space, and this one tells you a lot. So this is just a little example, and you can see that here very, very clearly as well. And every action has a reaction, I said earlier, should be. So if you look at place B on the left, if I switch over, nothing changes in B. But here, on the right-hand side, yes, there is impact, just through the use of a new geometry. That's why we like to use curves, right? Another thing is what we prefer is gradients. We don't like block color. Everything is gradient. Light shade gradients, color gradients. If you do that, and if you apply color, we apply it with scripts, with laws, with rules. Here, for instance, this color coding gives you a sense of a center. You're closer or further away from a center. It's just what you might recognize as stylistic elements. We just might have a predilection for. Is actually performing for us with the core competency of architecture, which is communicating, spatial communication, orienting, giving information. That's our core competency. And my stylistic repertoire works for me and for all of us in terms of what we need to achieve. And if the city becomes more complex, starting to build up and overlap and intersect more, on the left-hand side you had, let's say this was the era of deconstructivism, my youth, that I started at Zaha Hadid Architects. You allowed that move. You can't crash these things into each other. You're allowed to, you didn't have to regularize everything. So there was more registration of site continuity and complexities. If you start to build that up, and why we moved from this on left diagram to the right diagram, the tractability, first of all these intersection areas is much stronger, more inference potential, but also the segments you extract, they have more shape and form and recognizability. And then when you kind of try to chart a trajectory through this, a path through this complexity, you see that with this kind of spline curve, you have a much more legible environment. So the same amount of complexity, I would argue the right-hand picture and space would be much more legible, navigable, orientable performance. On the left-hand side, visual chaos assumes quite quickly. Complexity is too much. On the right-hand side, I can build up more complexity. So I'm saying maintaining legibility and a sense of order in the face of complexity. The complexity I cannot choose. That's given to us by society. But right now, since we don't do this, we actually do this. The complexity of societal processes generate pure visual chaos, what I call this kind of identityless urban sprawl and spill and agglomerations which are really dysfunctional. So these trajectories, you can't really follow a line like this, but you can follow a line like that. This is just a little hint at that these things meant to perform. They're not just about to be pretty. And they perform in ways which is architecture's primary performance. Because what I argue is this: the built environment, you say, what is architecture for? Shelter, keep the rain out, keep the wild beasts off. And well, that's trivial. We don't even need architects for that, right? You can have a builder to do that, or engineers doing this, And that's not really the key anyway. What I'm saying, what the built environment is doing, it is ordering social processes, right? It gives us an orientation matrix, what's going on where and how to find each other and to structure our lives. It's social structure which is delivered by the built environment. It's an ordering matrix, and that's what we should focus on. But it can only be that ordering matrix which it becomes transparent to the user, if the users actually can find their path through that. And that's very important, and that is the key. If you think of a city of 1 million people, and it's not, I take this idea of shelter away, let's say it's a very calm and sunny climate, very, very mild, and there is no issue of keeping the elements at bay or keeping well-tempered environments, then you could in theory eliminate the city and just have a kind of empty beach surface or a gray tarmac surface or a nice kind of gray undifferentiated rubber surface. But what of course would be lacking is all the information about social distinctions, differences, places. So you would take away the whole orienting information matrix, and therefore social structure would immediately collapse. And that's what the built environment delivers: social structure. And by the way, there is no society without such a settlement structure, because without settlement structure you can't even build up social order. You can't have a society without an artificially constructed built environment as an ordering system. And that's what we have to work on and continue to work on. And that's what I call the core competency in the end of architecture. Now this is some of the heuristics of parametricism, how we do that today when we have to build up larger and much more complex systems. We don't use these rigid forms like the circle, cube, and cylinder. We don't just repeat these forever like modernism, and we don't just collage them, place them next to each other without relationship. I mean, that's what happened in the last iteration after the collapse of modernism, which is all about repetition and seriality. Now we have this kind of collage of isolated elements. This is all from something which we say should avoid. What has been going on for several thousands of years and what is going on now, we should absolutely avoid that. And instead, we would say, instead of these rigid forms, we make these amoeba-like variable forms. We work with splines, with nerve surfaces, with the swarms, with particles, which are controlled with multiple parameters, so that they become malleable, flexible, can adapt to, resonate with. The systems we generate, instead of systems of repetition, like we see everywhere around us, we make these systems, we give them rules of differentiation. So instead of all the same, they shrink and expand and they become narrow and become wider, then become taller, then become, they have these kind of gradients and laws of differentiation, not random differentiation. So all systems are differentiated, and they can do that when the elements are variable. But the most importantly, if you have these multiple systems, for instance, you have a field of fabric, urban fabric, this correlates to the underlay, which is maybe a topography, and there's a script or rule which distributes the fabric onto the topography. You know, on the southern edges, depending on slope, translates into height, into orientation, and then, for instance, another subsystem. So you have a subsystem topography, you have a subsystem fabric, you have the subsystem roads. They're not just thrown on like a grid, irrespective, indifferent, but they're correlated, they're scripted off the existing. They drive according to a logic, according to a set of rules, scripted rules, you drive the streets through. That's the way you should work. And then you can infer one system of the other, right? If the streets trace and track and scan topography and find a path, you lift that up, you actually can infer the topography of the streets, or you can infer the streets of the topography. And since the fabric is correlated and rule-based, embedded, when you see the fabric, you know what the underlying topography is, you know where the streets are, you know where the river is, and that's exactly how nature produces its environment. It's inherently, I call it a complex variegated order, incredibly inference-rich and information-rich, because when you look at a valley, you can see where the river must be. And then the vegetation is also growing differentially, close to the river, away from the river. It changes as you go from north, south to east. It changes as you go higher. So everything is dependent on everything else and becomes a sign and clue towards everything else. So you have the topography, the river, the flora and the fauna would also settle in. And that's where we design. We settle, we script, we law. The laws of behavior and settlement and distribution are scripted like laws of nature, and then we would be able to navigate these environments with a kind of intuitive assuredness, like bird of prey just kind of intuitively finds exactly where its vital resources are, because everything is intricately connected as an information-rich environment. That allows these creatures to kind of home in on their resources, and that's what I'm talking about. And what is important is to realize also is that, so these are the formal principles, how we build up these new systems, but underlying there is, with this revolution in formal principles and methodologies on how to develop the forms, the urban forms, the architectural forms, behind that lies principles of how to understand the social purpose and functions of architecture. So, for instance, when we're talking about a program brief or something, and the function, we're also saying certain things we're no longer thinking of. We're thinking not in sort of a handful of fixed stereotypes. The house, the office, or the foyer, the classroom, the lecture hall, the corridor. I mean, this is, no, every corridor is different. It swells, it connects differently, it becomes maybe an informal gathering area, etc. Everything is kind of, and the events are no longer so stereotypical that everybody's doing the same thing, 9 to 5, a handful of categories define your life. Everything is very, very multiple and differentiated and nuanced. So we're saying no longer stick figures, no social homogenization, not everybody's life is the same. And we don't kind of zone these different areas. He is sleeping, he is working, he is entertainment. No, we bring these things together and we come in these complex mixes. So this is the world of modernism, which was totally rejected. And now we have to say all functions are parametrically variable event scenarios. They have also parameters. The events, the scenarios, the program has all these parameters which change. And the program's domains, they are differentiated. They're not, a handful of stereotypes which are repeated. They're all kind of articulate differently. And then, again, everything communicates with everything in terms of a mutual awareness and influence of event to event. If the event takes place here, then other subsidiary events feed off that. They're not independent. And that's why the spaces shouldn't be independent. So what I'm saying here, in terms of a style, each style has these series of formal rules or heuristics, I call them, and there's a certain functional understanding, which is unique to the style. And you can see here the way I describe this, that this style, with its understanding of functions, which matches the way we work on the formal side, that's the style of our times. Parametricism is simply the answer of architecture to the computationally empowered information society we live in, the global information society. We've already developed this answer. I mean, that's what we've done. We're fully exploiting the opportunities of the computational facilities which were given to us, and we use these facilities to address the key problems of articulating the density, this interaction, which comes out of that new civilization, which is very different from the modernist civilization. So what here again we have, we are facing that this isn't understood, that we are wavering, that we are pulling away from that, we are kind of becoming nostalgic, or that we are struggling maybe with issues of which are not our core issues, let's say. Any question at this time? Come on. Any question?
I have a question.
Yep.
So if you think this type of architecture would be like the new theme as such of the world, like the limitations of like the cost of this is a big limitation. How do you think that would, how do you think this style of architecture would be solved by that in the future, like globally?
Costs. Well, what I believe is that the way we are working, and for instance, the way we're working with algorithms and optimization, and the kind of instead of having one element extruded or repeated, we vary the elements. Materially, we're much more efficient. So our style is able to work with the sophisticated structural finite element analysis, optimization, evolutionary optimization, where the beam in the end is totally fitted and molded and eroded nearly to exactly the balance of forces which at this point is required. At another point, the beam will be different. We'll be kind of tracking the moment line, the different forces, and the spatial, whether we do a shell or let's say a waffle grid, will not be a repeated waffle. Will be a kind of tracking of the force lines, and then extruded according to the force intensity. So this will be the way we articulate. Now, the advantage of this is, of course, there's more intelligence, more information. So if you would do that with handicraft, it would be more expensive. But if you're working with milling machines and laser cutting, and reprogram molds anyway, then it doesn't matter if it's a repeated or differentiated. It's like when you print now, you print a simple grid or print a very intricate drawing, doesn't matter, right? So, but it will be materially much more light and efficient. So if the investment continues in these technologies, and this, then these architectures will be much cheaper. The steel tonnage, the material heaviness and burden of the environment would be much lighter. The same is with, and we can embody and incorporate environmental optimization technology. So if you have a volume and you put under modernism, you put a louver on this, you would put the same louver across the whole building. Maybe you leave the north side out, but you just wrap it around. That louver will be inefficient most of the time. It's only optimized for one angle, and the rest it's inefficient. What we do, we take the sun exposure map, we map it onto the envelope, we develop an algorithm which generates a geometric response to that incident of angle, and we will totally optimize. Each louver element will be different. It will be smaller, lighter, more efficient. In the end, you have a better environment, you have more transparency, you have less material, everything is more efficient. Of course, at the moment this costs more to do, but 20 years down the line, if this is understood, it will be cheaper. So everything will be and the big advantage is, if you develop the architecture like this, you get this information richness. Because if you're in a space where the structure is optimized for how much is above, or where the deepest span is, you know in the space where's the center of that span, in which direction is the space larger, even otherwise it's crowded. In the built environment, on an overcast day, you know where south, east, west. So you can follow the rules. So there's a kind of legibility issue where it becomes like nature-like built environment becomes possible. So it is communicative, empowering, but it's also going to be more efficient and cheaper. So that's I think. Would be my answer, although temporarily, of course, we at the moment at the cusp where some of it is still more expensive, clearly. But we have to execute buildings with reprogrammable molds where in the end there's a kind of marginal surcharge which you in the overall calculation might gain already, because you could with that malleability you can make more efficiencies. You can squeeze, for instance, our buildings like an amoeba into the site, rather than having to make the rectilinear. So we're gaining more size, have less space wastage, a little bit more still in the facade, but the facade in the end should be cheaper, etc.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I wanted to find out how, with this idea of self-organizing, sort of self-weaving development of design, how do you resist the power of that initial thought within you as a person, as an architect? That initial idea that comes to your head before you take the design to the system and let the software do it for you. How do you resist that drive, that push, that internal force?
Well, I mean, you got to familiar yourself into this world, right? So I think you're always working with tools anyway. Before you will have different tools. And what I see with this kind of working, you have a universe of creativity opening up for you, a whole field where you can develop ideas which you didn't even know about. So I think it's a much more creatively stimulating world, because now it's not only that, okay, I have to decide where to put the circle, right, or how many cubes I should shift around, but I have many more questions to answer. So, for instance, I have to ask, so what are my primitives? And I have now more ranges. I don't have only cubes and circles and cylinders and cuboids, etc. But I have a much more larger range of basic primitives I could start with. Whether it's inert surfaces, splines, particle swarms, particle spring systems, metaball systems, L systems. So there's many more starting points, and then I make choices, and I can use a computer to interact with and allow it to present me with alternatives within an initial setup. But then I have to answer a question: which which degrees of freedom can I give that further? And these are all creative choices, which you do relative to problems you want to solve, whether relative to a certain aesthetic expression you want to give because you want to make your contribution conspicuous in the urban environment in a particular way. And then you have so many interesting challenges how to creatively translate. For instance, challenge what I'm saying. You're no longer just placing the building into a context. You want this building to feed off and resonate with other buildings around. So if there's a big building over here, maybe how do I react to this? You make a creative choice. Do I want to allow this other building to indent or to magnetize a piece, or just in other ways resonate with this? So these are new questions which needs creative answers. Then you have to go and see, how do I implement this? To just model that by hand. It doesn't need to all be computational. I can also set myself these problems and model it by hand, but then I want to vary this, and then after I've remodeled it 5 times, I'm saying, hey, should I make a little script? This also makes the whole thing more rigorous, and I can say, now this body is not reacting to this, it's reacting to many places. And then maybe there's a river further away. You say, hey, maybe my site should also register that. It should tell me in which direction the river is, because it's a force in the city, it's something which should channel. So I make all my windows kind of pull out towards the river, etc., etc. And these would be little scripts. And then you'd say the closer the river, the further the pull out, etc. So these are all ideas you have, right? This is your creative ideas, what to respond to, how to respond to it, with which primitives, with what manipulations, with what variables. So the universe of creative invention and creative choice and idea development is, I think, much bigger. Whereas before you say, okay, which window should I punch into this thing and how many, or should I use? So I think that sometimes there's a misunderstanding, and I hear that sometimes that I think that the computer does anything for you. The computer doesn't, you have to kind of set it up. You have to generate ideas, and I think that the world of ideas you encounter is a whole new set of ideas and far further ranging. And what I like about this also is there's a clear criterion in set of the principles of how to make the design you started richer and more intense, more beautiful, just simply better, also in terms of performance. If I say, for instance, it should communicate as much as possible of its surrounding, as well as allowing its internal ongoings to appear on the facade. You can always do more of this. You've already resonated and take the river into account and the big building here. There's always more you could do. And then you kind of try to bring it in, and then you, of course, have to see, is it still registered? Does it still make sense? Or am I just, it becomes amorphous? But there's always more you can do, where the subsystems can respond to more. They can be more intricate with each other, rather than just being kind of next to each other. Each subsystem could be more varied internally, rather than having still a lot of repetition in it. So these kind of heuristics, these kind of don'ts and do's, they are set up so that you can always come back and say, hey, if I give me one more week, this thing becomes even more intense. So there's a very, very clear, and that's important for me, heuristics and directionality of how to progress the design.
Excuse me, I have a question. There was a slide you showed Grayling's block, and I want to ask, what's the relationship or difference between Grayling's block or blockism, or even another new term called blockitecture, with the parametricism?
The blocks, yeah. So, I mean, we've worked a lot with blocks, right? Urban blocks. I mean, but when we work with urban blocks, we don't do, particularly if we do a new larger field where you can have multiple blocks, we would first of all not make the blocks the same. Our default condition is to say, hey, if they have a field of 100 blocks, why should they be all the same? Most probably, is a better starting point to say, hey, I have a whole range of block sizes. So that I can, for instance, if it's a business district or something, so I can cater for a whole range of company sizes. And then I do the blocks, and not do them all the same as perimeter blocks. I make some of them closed, some of them more perforated, and some of them maybe very open and penetrable. So drive that range across the 100 blocks. That's the way we work, right? Our default condition would be start with variation. You might not even know exactly which company size you have to cater for. So give a whole range, and then let the company self-sort, and give a whole range of open to close, give a whole range of maybe heights. That's where we start. And when we give these ranges, we don't randomly scatter them. We have a rule how we apply them. You know, from left to right, we make the blocks bigger, but maybe that is from the center to the periphery, or inverse. And then it also tells me when I'm moving to the center or to the periphery. So these things become information. So that's the way we work. So the block is great. The block is one kind of paradigm that distinguishes between public space, street space, circulation space, and a kind of parceled mass of building, and you make that quite dense. This is a way of generating density in the city. So we can work with this, but we have our own way with working with the block. And it doesn't necessarily, for instance, I wouldn't say like Berlin is saying, they have to be 22 meter everywhere. I think that's kind of potentially disorienting. Or there has to be exactly that setback, etc., etc., etc. And that's find very kind of sterile and disorienting ultimately, because if you have a space, even like in Manhattan, you have a grid. That grid with a random scatter of buildings, very disorienting. Thank God in Manhattan you have the avenues and the streets, so you at least know whether you're on the north-south axis or whether you're on the east-west axis. But oftentimes you don't know whether you're going south or north, so you know. But so the symmetry breaking, the distinction already helps you. But then there's too much symmetry, or and symmetry is bad, monotony is bad, disorienting, and randomness, of course, is disorienting. And that's what all our built environments are currently based on. They're based on kind of serial grids with random scatter of stuff on them. And in the end, what we are faced with is what I call disorienting identity, this garbage spill urbanism. Nobody likes it. Everybody hates that. Right? Everybody finds, you can't imagine that anything which is built in the last 30 years since the crisis of modernism has any beauty to it. It's by definition nearly ugly. You can't do it. And I think we can do it. But the problem here is that there's the freedom of choices, the manifold of material choices, stylistic choices, architectural, when they are let loose and free, without principles, without a kind of overarching heuristics like I'm talking about, they just generate random garbage spill. And all garbage spills look the same, even though there's many different and intricate things in them. They cancel each other out into some kind of spill condition. And what I'm talking about is building up an urbanism the way I've been talking about it. You pick up the particulars of that topography with that river, and that drives this fabric, which these climate conditions, and this existing city which you're affiliating to. See what I mean? You build up identity. You build up unique places and recognizable identity which reinforce each other with each layer. And they generate organisms, species, or an ecology of species. And I think there will be, like this particular valley with this microclimate and microflora and fauna is this unique recognizable valley. All the different geographic regions in the world with their particular landscapes, that's what the urban environment could be, because we're developing the built environment precisely on the principles of natural environments. We, in a sense, graft and grow kind of species of buildings onto a particular topography or a landscape condition or existing conditions. Because it's like a flock of birds, particular birds, settling onto a particular cliff. Right? There are certain laws, certain rules. They're not going to, plug themselves, like this against the surface. They use for these kind of little terraces, and they line them up there, or the way they settle onto a tree, where they appear. This is rule-based. These are basically scripts. These are algorithms which which are followed by agents. This is agent-based modeling in nature, and we're using agent-based modeling when we design the city. We write rules by which the buildings settle in particular conditions and then grow to a certain size. It's like a kind of seeds flowing into a landscape and growing according to conditions and environments. That's why I have confidence that if we follow in this way of working, would become as it should be, because it has inherent rationality and performance advantages, become a universal condition which all architects adhere to, like in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, they adhere to modernism. We will get a kind of unified, elegant, and beautiful, and differentiated built environments which are climatically specific, topographically specific with respect to the program mixes which emerge, and they become transparent. And I think to some extent, modernism is, we can't continue modernism because it was too much homogenizing, too much based on a kind of society of mechanical mass production. But it's looking back, that modernism in a sense as a unified style, these are the last beautiful places in the world. Brasilia, Tel Aviv, the white modernism of Tel Aviv. I mean, the Miami Art Deco district, 1950s or something, 40s, 50s, and then, or maybe a 1960s campus. You know, there's a coherency and the logic there. It's not as intricate as what we're trying to do, but when it starts the 70s, 80s, where this breaks down and there's no new formation of a style, nobody can stand these environments. I mean, they just simply are unlivable, horrendous, creepy things. Right? So we need to, and that's our fault as a discipline, because we don't get it. We don't get that we can and will and should develop a kind of coherent new built environment which has these information richness and is of our time the way modernism was of our time. Anybody else?
So whereas I agree that the idea of using the curve to generate these geometries so that you achieve everything you've said, wouldn't it, for now, rather than waiting for things to catch up, wouldn't it make sense to program that into available sort of materials or systems that within sort of the area where you're constructing, and to use that, say, in a limestone ridge place or whatever, you find the limitations of that material, rather than forcing a material that can curve in the way that you
Absolutely. I mean, that's what we do. We do a lot of research, and we condone. I mean, this kind of, now we have material science. We can this sense which some of the modernists already had, that there should be some kind of material recognition of material logics, that you work timber with its grain and direction, etc. The way we, yes, absolutely. We shouldn't, it's not about kind of cookie cutter enforcing some kind of geometry on materials, but it's working with inherent material logics. You're working with fabrication logics. If you work with sheet metal, there's a certain constraints. You can only have single curvature. You can make conic, and then if you want to do something with that, it gives a certain character to tectonic character to the architecture, because you work with the material constraints, also with the fabrication, the tooling constraints. And that's something which becomes later on heightened into the ornament and character giving. That's very much the sensibility. And if you look at a lot of the people who work with us and in our movement, they have that same spirit. I mean, the great figure who's been advancing this, of course, was Fiotto also, where this whole idea of not inventing forms in the abstract, or just using these kind of few simple geometric forms you can handle, but allowing a morphology to find itself, the form finding of a morphology relative to a series of equilibrating forces, like the soap bubble experiment they did, the wool thread models they did, and the hanging models and fabric models. I mean, these are physical form-finding devices. And if you look at some of the algorithms we're using, they're just digital translations of this, which give us more freedom to play with these and also go beyond the natural ranges, and maybe then post-engineer the material for that. But all of these are very, very important insights because they give character.
And there's
Because there's lawfulness and constraints, and not the randomness of a willful design or garbage spill agglomeration of willful designs. These are highly, they have degrees of freedom, but they're always kind of lawfully constrained, and then in the end these laws generate this kind of recognizable character and predictable in a sense to some extent. Yeah, very, very important point, I think. That's the ethos of that style also.
Yeah, from what I understand is most of your work is sort of oriented towards spatial arrangement. So what I didn't get was how your building envelope actually comes together. And it's sort of, most of the work actually takes up the theme of Fordism. It's kind of like machine-like.
Post-Fordism, actually.
Post-Fordism.
It's very different from Fordism.
But to what extent do you actually take into consideration like the context of a building site? Because like if we look at the MAXXI museum,
Yeah.
what I notice is your roofscape. The roofscape is actually one of the only things that follows the context. But everything
Yeah.
else is like
Well, it's the interesting thing here with MAXXI, it tries to be rather contextual, the way it embodies and envelopes, encompasses some existing buildings, the way it picks up two conflicting urban geometries and mediates them with a curve, and also as you said, the kind of roof, the heights and roof patterns, striations in the context are kind of affiliated to. So that's something which, and also there's certain things you only discover when you go there. There's a certain pedestrian path which suddenly is continued through the building, etc. So it is meant to be. It's a good art project for me, what to say, where we're trying to be more contextual than any historical or even modernist building has ever been, or even postmodernist. Postmodernism, yes, sometimes with motifs which are repeated. Ours doesn't rely so much on motifs, but on geometric affiliations, where a new system just responds to existing influences and resonates with it. And that's the similar as with the Guangzhou opera house we have, where we also have internal relationships. Not necessarily the context is relatively unstructured because it wasn't built up, but there's always things. There's the front and the back side. There's orientation. All the elements orient. The way they interlock, the way they're embedded into a landscape. They don't sit on a flat surface, but they impress themselves into the surface and generate a kind of effect. Every action has a reaction. So when, the way this plinth is sculpted around is a kind of resonance of the object sitting and being received. That's the spirit. So it's always, contextualism is very, very, as an a priori, it's nearly a necessary condition. We don't allow ourselves to just play something unrelated. So there's always a question, and that's the creative question. How do you relate it? There's not one way to relate it. And you cannot say, well, this doesn't have the same color like the surrounding. That's not the only way to relate. You can contrast with color, but affiliate geometry, or you make different geometry, but you bring the color across. Bring texture across, bring all sorts of aspects. There's so many aspects you can pick on to create what I call networks of similitude and contrast, right? And that's the creative act. You just need to know that that's what you could be working on to then generate ideas about how I am affiliating. And the interesting thing is with a project like MAXXI or others, the context is often diverse. So there is something big and chunky on the one side, there's something kind of smaller grain on the left side, and becomes kind of, there's an open garden on the right side. So you want to affiliate to these. In the traditional, let's say before parametricism, you had to say which of these different contexts should you make your building similar to. You had to choose. You have to make it, one of these coming over. We're saying, well, maybe there's something which is like a chameleon, amoeba-like condition which can be similar to many things at the same time, some kind of chimerical multiple affiliation would be, for instance. That's a very, very powerful idea. So what we're trying to do is something which is similar, which affiliates and connects to and makes itself similar to many different things at the same time, like you can. Right? You can be as a family member similar both to your father and to your mother, and in all different ways. You have the eyes of X, the hair of Z, and the, whatever. Another aspect connects you to the third element. So that is something we can do, should do, might do, and then you can even make further. Affiliation is an important concept. So that's what we're doing. You can criticize. You can look. Of course, we can always criticize our projects and self-criticize because we have the criteria. You can say, hey, but you couldn't you have registered this condition? It's like you're insensitive to that condition. You're not gone far enough. You're falling short. Or this project really for me doesn't have that sense of embeddedness. I think our projects do have a much stronger sense of embeddedness than you would find in the Modernist project. But of course, they could always do more. That's the beauty also of a heuristic. So heuristic is a set of principles to progress your projects. You can always then use to criticize yourself. Yes, there could have been a better version of the project. Yeah.
You spoke about the ways that parameters in the built environment feed into your approach. What about the parameters that relate to the way the urban environment is occupied, that are parameters that you cannot predict or you cannot foreshadow?
Yeah, it's a very, very good point. I mean, actually, I haven't shown that here, but if you look back at some of my recent lectures or look at my website to pick up some of the writings I've been pushing, I was talking about parametrically variable event scenarios. In the end, what is very important is precisely to host these events, but also to communicate to other events and to audiences, to passers-by, that this event is taking place or will take place, or that this is a place for such and such event. So, and how to work on this? I mean, I've started now a new research project where I am trying to do something what I call live process modeling. You know, for instance, crowd modeling, which is used to model circulatory flows in train stations, airports. Oftentimes it's evacuation scenarios, it's kind of throughput scenarios. And I'm saying we need to work, and we're working on these tools with student groups in particular, and PhD student, as well as with Bureau Happold, on a kind of generalized crowd modeling. So precisely because we're saying the event is not just a label writing foyer, it's something which is, where are these people coming from, how many, how is that fluctuating, pulsating, and how is my architecture channeling this, maybe responding to this. The meaning of that space, foyer, is precisely how it hosts and structures these ongoings. And we do that by bringing the agent-based crowd modeling into the model, and I call this, we're bringing the meaning of the spaces into the model. And I was saying, nearly saying now something like this, we should do that. When you start with your bubble diagram, sketching out, you should actually have already, if you have a brief and you're designing an office complex or a small university complex for maybe for 2,000 students or 1,000 students, or and plus 100 teachers and 50 visitors, put these onto the side, put the dots in, how many of them will be there, and how do you draw a line and it bifurcates that group of agents, structure the flow, separate them. So we're always working with the crowds, I'm saying, and that's what we're doing. We want to simulate the live process and then have the agents, the way the agents move through these spaces, their behavioral patterns depends on what they understand where they be. If they're in a public space, they behave in one way, and they're moving in a more private or campus zone, they become more open to each other. So the rules of engagement of the crowds, how the crowds interact with each other, depends on where they are, and they're channeled. So that's very important. That's what we're working on. You can imagine when I was first talking about the way we use agents, for instance, swarms of houses settling onto a topography. We're now letting swarms of people settle into that urban fabric with the rules of behavior we would expect. And then we can test the live process. So and that's the most fundamental and profound in the end game of architecture, to actually structure that life process. That's what client comes to us. The client comes to us with an institutional idea. I want to have that cafe, I want to have this bar, I have this club, or I have this school, and I want to have this kind of character of interaction, this kind of events take place because they're productive for me and my institution. They're life enhancing, and that's the client is offering basically a space to the public or to certain audiences to give them a certain experiences and interaction. And that's what in the end it's all about. The beautiful design, the life enhancing design is a design which delivers the kind of character of interaction and life which the entrepreneur or host or client, if you like, might be a community, might be a public space, is actually had in mind or was dreaming about or wanting to happen, wanting to see happen. And if we can make that happen, then we are great. We are really sophisticated architects, and that's why for me I'm pushing recently the crowd modeling, because that's I can kind of start demonstrating that we can make it happen. Because I can also have empirical analysis. How do people behave in spaces? I can also try to make hypotheses. What if they would understand better that certain thresholds mean certain things? You can coordinate the interaction. You have to cooperate and coordinate interactions through spaces, through giving people an understanding where they are and what they are to expect and what to do and not to do. That's the way society works. If you don't understand where you are, you're always an elephant in the kind of porcelain shop. You disturb everybody and so you need to have that awareness of what's going on where, and that's what I'm testing. So it's very important, the social processes modeling as the important subsystem in all the subsystem correlation I was talking about. And that's a parametric, my project of so-called parametric agent-based semiology, where we can really home in on demonstrating that these spaces I've been describing to you credible, and I don't have to just talk about this. I actually can work on this. I can develop the agent. I can say, okay, now I want to make the students a bit more agile, or I think, what if they get closer to each other? What kind of groups do I want to build up? 3 minutes group, 5 minutes group. What is the dwell time here? What is the interaction density? What is the encounter frequency? I can then measure it off and say, hey, if I do it this way, then I have a kind of student-teacher informal encounter, whatever, 5 times per hour. In this setup, with these entrances, I get it 10 times per hour. In this setup, though, but there's a pro, and the con might be in this first setup, I get the kind of the interaction length a little bit longer. Whatever, you can really home in on this, and that has a lot to do with the geometry, but also with how much people are aware of what's going on where. So I can give that agent that awareness. If the agent sees something, which is a clue for something else, because I have a rigorously developed environment, I can also credibly say, yes, the agent will home in onto the space, which is not yet in view, because it can follow that gradient like a bacteria follows a nutrition gradient in a petri dish. That's the way we can navigate a lawfully structured environment. We can't do it in a garbage spill, but in a lawfully structured environment, we could give people much more assuredness and intuitive move through and finding each other and so on. And we can then say, hey, this is the hypothesis I have, and this is what the kind of life process I will be able to engender, facilitate, and that's really the core competency, And then the engineering says, yes, and the roof will not crash down. Yes, the second one is your responsibility. I want to work with you to understand how that roof is intricate and light, and also kind of tells me where the forces flow, where the entrance. If you have a big roof, the entrances would radiate into the structure, right? Because that's where there's no support, and that means in turn you can infer back from the structural pattern where the entrances are, etc. Everything becomes a clue for everything else. You can even use M&E systems instead of always hiding structure, M&E, everything behind plaster walls, which are mute and indifferent. You could even show these veins and vessels, and then you can follow the big ducts into the auditorium. But the main thing is literally then showing how people actually find the auditorium. Or I can participate in a space. We're also developing institutions. Maybe an auditorium shouldn't be a locked space. Maybe there should be glass. Maybe people could kind of pull close and pull away from this. So it's more parametrically variable. It's not a lecture hall for 200. No, it's a space which pulsates, which is coming and going. Those who are really interested come closer or stay longer. Those who, there's a kind of homeostatic pulling away. And we can start to simulate this. And maybe also the latest thing is then in this one, responsive environments where you have, glass surfaces which become milky. You have louvers which open up, track the sun, or if somebody's walking and the louvers open up briefly to give that person a view, or screen that person passing by from viewing. So this also becomes, they become literally responsive environments. But I think your point is very, very good. Anybody else? I mean, what I want to say is that these things are difficult to do, but there's a lot of expertise and skill being built up. You get into the world of Rhino Grasshopper, a series of plugins you can do. You can work, you can set up in evolutionary algorithms, learning structures, optimization. Now's the time in your student life. That's when you can kind of do with your time, kind of to some extent, what you want, and you have the energy and the time resource to get into this world. Once you're out of here, it's going to be hard. If you don't have the skill already, they'll put you to what you can do, so it's very precious that this is not only intellectually stimulating. I think the way forward, but it requires that an investment in also the hard skills of doing some of that stuff, as well as the intellectual grasp of it. I mean, you can also, if you find others to do it for you, great. But at that time, to participate, and also if you do some of this, it gives you ideas how to be creative about it. I think it's very important that you don't miss that boat, and that's why, I'm quite passionate about talking about it, because that's very, very different. I mean, if I think about the last 10 years, every year there's, with AADOL, there's new software ambitions, new intelligence coming in. They started with Maya, then we're moving on to Grasshopper came was a huge kind of thing. Processing in terms of swarm logic. Now a lot of physics engine, how do you build indirectly structural and physics simulations and environmental courses into your setup. Now the new thing is crowd modeling. I mean, that's something, it's not trivial. I mean, the tools are developed so it makes it easier. Right? You don't, there's things like Soft Image in Miami and so on. But so every year there's new stuff. Whereas in Nike, when I was a student, there was a pen, and there was a pen, and there was a pen. I mean, let's say, I was one of the first computer generations, so I went through this. But the previous generation was, they had for 50 years no change in the tool set. It was a ruler and drafting machine, and it was 50 years later still the ruler and drafting machine. And so that's different. You can't rely on the fact that what you've learned at the beginning of your career was still kind of viable 20, 30 years on. But you need to have the entry point into this. And I think that's very important for you to grasp. And anybody else?
Do you think we'll be able to, the idea of the movement, how we've had loads of different movements, yesteryear, thousands of years in architecture to like modernism.
Yeah.
Do you think at this point in the 21st century people can agree on a movement to say, okay, this is what we'll do, this is how we'll build?
It's harder. I mean, but it was, my story is like this. There was, there's a rhythm in history. So if you go, there are periods of, and this has to do with the historical changes. So for instance, I would start talking about the epochs of socioeconomic development, right? So there is hundreds of years of feudalism. categories. Certain technologies, agricultural and handicraft, city, land, certain social structure on that. And that goes on for a while, and then you start, the city's becoming bigger, and you have something more trade-based, and you have kind of early capitalism. There's a new dynamic coming into play, right? Where the handicraft shops become much larger, several hundred people, and they're distributed. There's changes in technology and social setup, and that generates a new city, ultimately new style. And I'm talking, for instance, the transition from the medieval Romanesque into Gothic as transition into Renaissance. The moment of the Renaissance, as a truly architectural style, means something in terms of the development of civilization, and that then develops for states. There's this kind of transition period which is quite tumultuous, and then there's a kind of new era of relative stability where new system locks into place. In Renaissance, when you go from Renaissance, it develops through Mannerism into Baroque, and the Baroque era is different from the Renaissance. The Renaissance era is actually the era of the early capitalist city-state, whereas the Baroque is larger social structures. It's the France of Louis XIV, the Vatican's Rome. They are much larger building complexes, larger territories, larger administrations, and they need a new style to express that. The Baroque city is the kind of, it has. The Renaissance has local symmetries which adds up. Each piece is separately symmetric, and you can build up small clusters. The Baroque is local asymmetries, this curvature, which creates huge, large, integrated complexes. Convex, concave, asymmetrical parts into some big thing, big axis cutting very far onto the horizon. They can articulate much larger unities. So there's an advantage which ties in with that new era of the absolutist state, which is different from, the France of Versailles as capital is a different situation for architecture than Florence and the Medici. New architecture representing a new stage of civilization. Then comes the next stage, which is kind of the industrial revolution, first manufacture, industrial sprawl, back, you get the picturesque. It breaks down these big absolute state, breaks down into kind of the quasi-sprawling situation. Then it becomes, you have the 19th century. Anyway, what I want to say, one of the big next step is modernism. You have this mechanical mass production society with the social revolutions, with the worker state and the mass society as clients, very, very different from the 19th century. And that starts to look different, a totally different urbanism, right? You also have cars and railways at that point very strongly. So that shows up in that system of separating out the different zones, the business district, the residential districts, the factory district, all in seriality, repetition. It's a certain physiognomy, certain look of the civilization. That's the style, ultimately. The style fits to that. And in these transitions, when you go, for instance, from the 19th century, which is the era of pre-socialist, pre-modernist, laissez-faire capitalism, is the era where many free choices are made and you have multiple historical styles. If you go from this to modernism, which from the 20s to the 60s is for over 50 years stable, in that transition you have a lot of upheaval and different manifestos and different groups. You have the constructivists, you have the expressionists, you have the neo-classicists, you have organic architecture, you had Art Nouveau, you have many different things. I call them transitional styles, and then they kind of converge to something modernism. And modernism, you can say, they stopped all these other movements, and everybody was converging. 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, to the 70s. That was a big conversion. In the height of modernism in the 1950s, you could totally guarantee everybody was working under the same ethos principles. They were all admirers of Le Corbusier and Mies and Gropius, and these guys were still working. So there's an enormous clarity and unifiedness of the style and principles, which delivered whole cities. Brasilia is an example. Now, when this came into crisis and we're moving to a new civilization, this is a civilization of mechanical mass production, socialism, and so on, into an era which is now, let's say, the microelectronic revolution, we have lifestyle diversification, globalization, neoliberalism is a very different, Britain, you can see it here with, in the 70s, that modernism really goes into crisis. The world looks again very differently. It becomes this garbage spill, deconstructives in the sense, the aesthetics of that. But what I'm saying is, you're saying, can there be a movement? At the transition, there were many different movements. There's postmodernism. There's deconstructivism. There's neo-modernism, minimalism. Postmodernism went into some kind of neo-classicism even again. So there's these many different styles. And what I saw in the 90s, so that is the kind of late 70s all through the 80s and the early 90s, I can see a convergence. I saw that a lot of people suddenly got convinced that you could work with these kind of new, fluid, computationally driven, but also by hand already, sense of complex coherencies. I think there was a very, very strong conversion. I think it's nearly all through the 90s, where virtually, I would say, in the most advanced architecture schools in cities, people were working in that direction. Whole schools, totally unified behind that, like Columbia University, half of the AA, and many other places. UPenn, and all over the world. So I think there is a potential of this convergence. And I think that should happen, because the whole point of having postmodernism, deconstructivism, minimalism, all these different attempts to find an answer, because modernism, nobody wanted anymore. Nobody wanted to live in these monotonous sleeping silos, Brasilia wasn't an inspiration. So these places are now thought to be dysfunctional because you need mixity, you need intensity. That's why we moved back. This suburbanization stopped, so people were voting with their feet against modernism. Modernism was kind of intellectually bankrupt. They started to dynamite big housing blocks which were just built 20 years earlier, because this was understood to be not the way forward. And then you had there was a shock in the profession. Everybody thought modernism was great and fantastic. Suddenly it doesn't fit, it's not the solution, we have to do something else. Then you have all these different movements coming up, which were craving for complexity, which thought architecture should be not monotonous, should speak, maybe they were toying with historical motifs, different things. And out of that, I think the conclusions out of this funneled into what I then call parametricism. So I think there could be and should be a convergence, because otherwise, if all these fragmented different movements, there is no new, there wouldn't be then a new answer to the challenges and opportunities of this current civilization. We wouldn't, for instance, if we don't pick up this, we wouldn't make use as architects of these new technologies in the fullest sense. But every other domain of life starts to use it in the fullest sense, right? If you look at the finance sector, they're all about algorithms and electronic money and bitcoins, and I mean, you know, that's just one example. Medical, all the kind of high technology and computational support systems which feed into this. Physics, there's no science which isn't 100% working now. Computational simulation tests and so on. The whole engineering discipline. If we exclude ourselves from this, we are doing it, but the discipline doesn't recognize that we have to develop collectively, like the modernists for the era of mechanical mass production and industrialization. The discipline has to collectively gear up and develop a new pertinent best practice. There must be this convergence, because if you have that fragmentation, first of all, a lot of this is simply just retro impotence, but also if we have to develop a city of the 21st century and somebody does here a piece of postmodernism, then somebody else comes in with a piece of minimalism, and somebody else tries to make connections but can only do them partially, this all hampers each other. We stand each other's way. These efforts don't add up to anything. They just add up to some kind of cacophony. So every other discipline, in a sense, I mentioned a few, they develop. Even in the political system, there's a convergence, of course, of some kind of what it means to be a best practiced representative democracy with institutions and so on. It's not easy to implement it everywhere, but there's at least an idea what a proper political system or regime should be, and we understand what a proper mass media, or as I said, certain sciences, how they function best practice. So I think the convergence is, you say, yes, we don't see it in architecture. We saw it for a while, and I think it was defrayed and derailed by that kind of stagnation, and then there's some institutions but they should be, I think, they should be, because the coherency of the built environment acts as one, right? Things connect and tie in with each other. You can't have, it's like having doctors working on a patient with different philosophies and different recipes. You can't, it doesn't work. So what I'm saying, first we have to make this argument. We collectively have to find a way forward. And it means we need to at least we need to fight for and aim for and debate the convergence the tendency and direction which the discipline should take, the discipline's answer to the new stage of civilization. That's the first. A lot of people deny that. Well, they're happy to leave everything in pluralistic cacophony. I'm saying no. First premise is there must be a convergence. Second is, which is it? And how do we achieve it?
Yeah. Sorry, because I think like the convergence that we've seen, or that I've sort of noticed, is people are agreeing in this fight against temperature rise and global warming.
Yeah.
That their people is becoming a sort of movement and influencing a lot of people's design that is bringing something together. We were starting to see trees, for example, on buildings and skyscrapers. So
yeah, but that's not enough. I agree with that. I think the ecological challenge and environmental footprint needs to be considered, but it's a constraint. I agree with that, and I think parametricism is the only methodology and style that can, in its fullest sense, deliver in a nuanced and efficient way to these desires. As a little example of the louvers, and we can model wind flow, and we can adapt the morphology to that. Whereas, because we're very open to what the morphology in the end is, as long as it's kind of coherently driven and lawfully applied. We don't mind. We don't have a prejudice, right? Most probably it will end up with curvature, but if it's in certain edges come in there because they're lawfully available for breaking wind flows, we have no prejudice against that, right? So whereas a neoclassicist would have, they want their motifs and their symmetries, and I think that's fallacious. And the modernist minimalist wants to have the repetition going on, and he bleaches out the complexity of ecological performance, of social differences. We don't. Our sensitivity and ethos is one of kind of performance, adaptiveness, translation, and we have so that is very important to realize that the ecological we can deliver, but the ecological is only a constraint. We have to think about what is the life process of the city. How is the communication event scenarios unfolding, and how we can sustain this? How can we make each of our lives more vital, more fruitful, more connected, more of a sense of awareness of what's going on? And these are the things we know now. I mean, you feel it. I mean, people want to live in proximity with ongoings, because they feel that they need to be part of something. Because if they sit somewhere in the province away too much, they might lose. They might be thinking I should work on this, but in the meantime, it's no longer relevant. You need to feel the connection. So how do we make that possible? How do we bring people together in dense urban agglomerations and sort them and filter them and connect them? That's the key. Ecological, how much energy this burns. Yes, I need to first know what do we need to deliver, and then ask the question, how can I do it with the least energy? But not energy in its own principle. It's like, well, let's not build anything, or let's build concrete bunkers which 1 meter insulated walls. I mean, it makes no sense. We have to distinguish between the vital agenda of the social performance and social functionality of the built environment, and then there are certain constraints like the ecological constraints. Now, if you come in trees, just to say, they could be part of but we'd have to deliver this always with constraints, and and we select from the different ways of meeting the constraints because of our agenda. So how do we actually make our projects ecologically lighter? That's, you know, and there are many, many different ways. And there's no absolute way. There's never an absolute way. There's always trade-offs and multi-objective optimization and balancing and equilibrium we develop. So that's why you have to kind of make yourself equipped with tools to orchestrate these multi-objective. And what I've come to believe is, you know, the evolutionary process is doing some of that. And if you're moving from modeling to scripting to genetic algorithm and evolutionary setup, that would be another kind of empowerment. We can do it, but it's, you know, it's very hard to do that.